Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the sunniest Baltimore Book Festival ever. My name's Iris Kirsch. I'm a collective member at Red Emma's and a Baltimore City Public School teacher, and it is my great honor to welcome our next guest. We have Matt Kennard here. He's a journalist currently based in Mexico City. He's writing his next book. He's written for the Chicago Tribune, the Financial Times, Salon, The Guardian, and this is his first fantastic book, which really delves into the insidious new hiring practices, or I guess recruitment practices for the U.S. Army. I wanted to share an anecdote. Some of you may know Eddie Conway, at least by name. He's a Baltimore Black Panther and a friend of the Red Emma's Collective. He is currently in jail in Jessup and has been locked up for 42 years. I have the honor to get to visit him sometimes. And one time last spring, he mentioned to me that there were people inside who are part of white supremacist, extremist militia groups who are kind of outwardly preparing for a race war, which he thinks is in some ways funded by people who have a lot more money than these guys, to subvert a class war. So I tried to do some research into that, and the only thing that I could find a little bit of was like some stuff about what happened in Florida after Trayvon Martin's death. It was really, really hard to find this information. Well, the whole first chapter of this book is everything I ever wanted to know about these gross militias. And then he goes on to criminals, like convicted murderers and rapists, alcoholics, drug users being actively recruited into the U.S. military. So we're going to hear from Matt, and then we're going to open it up for questions. So thank you all for being here, and thanks, Matt.
Thanks, everyone, for coming. Usually I find the most interesting way to do this is to just outline the thesis of the book, and then you guys can ask questions, because I'm sure you guys want to find out specific stuff. So the book opens with a speech that Donald Rumsfeld gave on September 10th, 2001, the day before the terrorist attacks. And he basically outlined a program to transform how the United States would fight wars in the future. It eventually became known as transformation. His idea was that after the end of the Cold War, large land armies were an anachronism, that nowadays the United States should go into another country with 2,000 special forces, take out the regime, and get out within 2 years. I mean, it was quite a radical position to take, and as the build-up to the war in Iraq got going, it put him at odds with the military establishment, who were basically saying to him, we need 300,000 troops to get a handle on Iraq when the fighting's over. And Rumsfeld was saying, no, we need maybe 50,000. I mean, eventually they compromised and it was about 150,000, but the original war planning from 1998 for the war in Iraq called for 380,000. So that's the sort of context where of the book. Rumsfeld's idea that you'd only need small amounts of forces was completely wrong, as we now know, because 4 years into the war in Iraq, it was upwards of 250,000 troops were deployed there if you include private contractors. So you had this situation where the US needed vast amounts of troops, and they had not in any way planned for this vast deployment. So one way to deal with that would have been to enact conscription, like they did in the Vietnam War and like they had in the Civil War and at other times. The Bush administration would have done this, and the Democrats were pushing them to do this, but they knew that it would be the straw that would break the camel's back, because as we know, the war in Iraq by that point was hugely unpopular. So to conscript the nation's youth into the fighting would have basically just turned the tide and probably would have ended the war in Iraq much quicker than it did. So in the absence of conscription, they took a different path, which was to change the regulations on recruitment. Some of that was public, so when they were scrambling for troops, they raised the enlistment age from 35 to 40, and then that didn't work, so they raised it again to 42. They started letting in retirees who had served in Vietnam. They started letting them come back. So that was a sort of, when I arrived to do my master's in investigative journalism. It was quite a big story at the time. They were letting in various groups and being public about it because they were trying to attract more troops. So I had a hunch that if they were being public about these groups, what about the ones that they were letting in and not telling anyone about? So I started looking into the neo-Nazi and white supremacist movement and found out pretty quickly that the US military was basically operating an open door policy, i.e. the regulations that did exist on white supremacists and neo-Nazis, that you couldn't get in with a swastika tattooed on you or other white supremacist insignia. They were basically throwing that out the door and letting anyone in. So I looked into that for a year and interviewed extremist veterans that had served in Iraq and Afghanistan, occupied populations that they thought were subhuman. Now, it really does horrify to think of what they were doing out there, but we probably won't ever know. So I interviewed them for a year. That story was eventually published in Salon, and I was approached to do a book, and the book basically pulls together that research plus looking at all the other groups that were enfranchised by the war on terror. So it goes from street gangs to, as was mentioned, felons, people guilty of rape and murder, etc. And then you had the other side. It wasn't just recruitment, it was retention as well. So they weren't just recruiting people, they were allowing people to stay in the military once they found out they were addicted to drugs, addicted to alcohol, etc. So the book basically just goes through each group and charts what happened during the war on terror with each group. And I mean, some of it is counterintuitive. Say, for example, there's a chapter on gay and lesbian service members. Now, the narrative is that the Bush administration was one of the most homophobic in recent history, which was true. But ironically, during the war on terror, gay service members had a renaissance just purely because, as I said, the US military could no longer afford to kick them out. So these people were allowed to stay in even though they were serving under an administration that thought their sexuality was an abomination. So, some of it is counterintuitive. I mean, there's also the fact that the Bush administration was pretty jingoistic and anti-immigration, but yet they enlisted huge numbers of foreign citizens to fight in Iraq and Afghanistan. So, that's the basic outline of the book. I mean, you guys can ask specifically about the different groups that you're interested in. The one I get asked about most, for obvious reasons, is the neo-Nazis and white supremacists, because there's two sides to that story. One is, what were these people doing out there in Iraq and Afghanistan? And it's also, what are they doing now they're back in the United States? I mean, I know a journalist who's planning to write a book in the near future called When the War Came Home, because the vast amounts of street gangs, white supremacists, hardened criminals that were trained in tactics and weapons out in Iraq and Afghanistan, they didn't come back to the United States to become vicars. They were all looking to do the same sort of violent actions here as they were undoubtedly up to in Iraq and Afghanistan. So there's two sides to it. And I mean, you saw that recently with the Sikh temple massacre in Wisconsin, which was carried out by a neo-Nazi army veteran. And what's quite scary about that situation is that he was serving in the 1990s when there's commonly assumed it's the US military were being quite hard on neo-Nazi and white supremacists because of the Timothy McVeigh bombing. Timothy McVeigh was also a veteran, so there was obviously a real outpouring of anger after that from the American public in 1995, saying why was our taxpayers' money paying to train this neo-Nazi? So apparently they were being hard on it at that point. The example of Wade Page shows that they weren't really, because articles came out subsequently that Wade Page was open about his white supremacism while he was serving. So if I had to make predictions, I'd say that massacres like that will happen over the next decade or two, because they've allowed vast amounts to serve. And I mean, obviously these individuals are sick and repugnant individuals, but the blame should also be on the military brass that allowed them to serve. Because the US military often holds up these individuals who are guilty of specific transgressions and says, oh, they're crazy lowlife and an exception, because it takes the heat off them. But often it's much more important to look at what the brass were doing, because a lot of the racism, a lot of the basic dehumanization of the Iraqi and Afghani people came from the brass. I mean, there's this term, Hajis, which is what soldiers and commanders would call Iraqis and Afghanis in the war zone, which is a racist term. It's like the N-word in the US and the UK. And that was, I talked to veterans that basically said that was endemic throughout the brass, i.e. the commanders were using this. So although racism was endemic throughout the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, didn't occur in a vacuum. It was actively used by the brass. I mean, you can come up with conspiracies about why that is. I mean, obviously, soldiers who are occupying populations that they see as subhuman will probably be more effective in killing and carrying out the tasks that are set them by the command. So so there's two sides to that story, and I mean, there's two sides to every one of these chapters. Is what happened in the war zone and what's going to happen in the United States over the next 10, 20 years. I mean, we saw something similar after Vietnam. Most people will know of the term Vietnam syndrome, where the abuse of active duty and active duty personnel and the veteran community by the military during the war in Vietnam and subsequently, where they refused to give them healthcare treatment and stuff, created this effect where the American population were put off the military and recruitment levels went right down. People were basically saying, we won't fight your wars anymore. And that was given by the mainstream media, given the name Vietnam syndrome. I mean, I think we're seeing something along those lines with Iraq syndrome, because recruitment went up during in the aftermath of the financial crisis, but it's actually they're suffering again. So we might see something along those lines. If anyone has any, well, you had some questions, didn't you?
So, first of all, I want to say that the adorable British accent comes through in the book. There were some sentences that I was like, this doesn't make sense, and I read it in a British accent, and it made perfect sense. So, my more serious question is, the first two chapters, which make up the bulk of the book, talk about white supremacists and gang members. Now, I mentioned at the beginning that I have this hypothesis from a Black Panther who's on the inside in a federal detention facility, that he feels like there are people in power who are trying to gear up for a race war to prevent a class war, which might seem inevitable during times like these. You've got these extremist groups going in together. There's graffiti all over Baghdad. They're kind of building these hateful relationships with each other. They're sneaking guns out. There's crazy statistics in this book about people mailing guns back home. To what degree do you think that the government and or the military and or some of the subcontractors, some of the special interest groups, may be actively trying to train these American soldiers to go have some crazy jihad back here?
All right, well, there's two parts to that question. Firstly, about the racial holy war. I mean, to say whether the US military is actively recruiting these people because they want to start a race war back in the US, I'm not sure. But what is definitely true is that, having spoken to these white supremacist leaders, the leaders of the movement, for a year, all of them were explicit about why they asked their members to get military training. They said, we want them to come back and help us in what they call RAHOA, which is a short for racial holy war. It's an ideology which is subscribed to by quite a few extremist groups, and it basically says that at some point in the near future, the US, the domestic population, it will erupt in a race war where races will fight each other and then eventually take down the corrupt central government, which they call ZOG, which is short for Zionist Occupation Government. It's an updated Jewish conspiracy theory. So there's no doubt about the first part of that definitely the people that were out there were not out there to spread freedom and democracy to Iraq and Afghanistan. They were out there to acquire training which they could use back in the United States. That's unquestioned. Now, on the second point of whether they were actively recruited, I did hear from various extremists that their command would, and this is a quote, would send them on the hardest missions because they were viewed as more warlike and hardcore. I mean, obviously, if if you subscribe to a racist, violent ideology, your attitude is going to be more warlike. So some of them told me that their command would send them on the hardest missions. Now I can't vouch for that, but I mean it's probably true. But I think the moral issue, it doesn't make much of a difference. I mean, to say whether they're actively recruiting or they recruited them, it doesn't make much difference. The military is still culpable for letting these undesirables in, because they undoubtedly were carrying out all sorts of atrocities in Iraq and Afghanistan. Now, whether they actively did it or they did it passively, I don't think there's much of a moral difference. They're both morally repugnant positions to take. And I mean, the domestic U.S. population is going to become increasingly angry when they understand the scale of this stuff. I mean, you saw recently at Fort Stewart, I don't know how many people are aware of this, it was quite a big story at the time and then sort of went off the radar, but there was a white supremacist or sort of radical right-wing militia at Fort Stewart that was busted a couple of months ago, and they were planning to assassinate President Obama to poison the water supply in Washington. And the leader of that militia had been got into the military on what was called a moral waiver, which were waivers which are given to hardened criminals so they can serve. Now, in normal times, the moral waiver system actually is quite a good system, because obviously you shouldn't close an individual off to every institution in society just for one transgression. Maybe they smoked a joint when they were 18 and got caught. They shouldn't be locked out. So moral waivers do have a purpose, but during the war on terror, it was completely stretched just because they needed to stock the fighting force. So they started letting in people who were guilty of rape, murder. There was even 2 soldiers that were suspected of a domestic terrorism attack that were allowed to serve. So that had an awful effect. And then this case at Fort Stewart shows what these people are doing in there. This guy, the ringleader of this active duty militia, which wanted to assassinate President Obama, was allowed in the U.S. military on a moral waiver. So that, I don't know if they were giving moral waivers because they actively wanted rapists and murderers, but the fact that they knew that it was happening I think is equally morally reprehensible. So, yeah, I hope that answers it.
Yeah, thanks. We're going to open it up for questions. Because we're recording, even if you speak loudly, we'd like you to speak into the mic. So can I get hands for questions? I thought you might.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I came in like 10 minutes late. I just wanted, I think it's important that while we're talking about this, like in the same time period that you're covering, there's also been the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. There's been pushes like some of the statutes in the DREAM Act, but also things larger than that. There's also people I know who join the military who are from undocumented parents, and the recruiter told them, well, if you join, we'll legalize your parents, and this and that, which was a lie. In some cases, they actually advocated for it. So I think that, like, the bigger issue, I think, like, I don't think of it as a conspiracy. I think of it as, like, they want people to join the military to fight in the wars. And this is, like, a chunk of the kind of crap that they do to push people into it. Yeah. At the same time, like, communists sent their members into the military in Vietnam and urged them not to avoid the draft, to organize. And that's what the Nazis are doing now, and that's what some of these groups are doing. So there's, like, I don't think it's, like, one specific moral push. I think it's, like, people are trying to get people into the military.
Exactly.
And the other thing, and I'm not saying that you weren't saying this, but I think it's important, like, when we're looking at people like the dude in Wisconsin and Timothy McVeigh and these types of people who have been veterans. Son of Sam, the serial killer, was a veteran. Yep. There's been a lot of veterans who've committed atrocities. There's also been a lot of veterans who've become pacifists and become part of left movements and anti-war movements, or, you know, so I think it's important that we not stigmatize it, but that we do recognize the specific role that the trauma of the military has played in people like Timothy McVeigh, but also in that maybe Timothy McVeigh is not an example of a veteran who went crazy and blew up a building, but it's an example of a neo-Nazi who sought military training to more effectively carry out things that he was already on top of, you know.
Yeah.
But maybe you could talk about that too. Like, did you see this, like, in these people that you were talking to, these veterans? Was it more of like the results of like military training and military trauma, or was it more like a?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think it's both. I mean, most of the extremists that I interviewed that had served in Iraq and Afghanistan were extremists before they went into the military, and they said that part of the reason I went is I wanted to get the skills and the training. But then you also do hear of the people. I mean, there was a report that came out in 2009 called Right Wing Resurgence. It was from the Department of Homeland Security. It was by an analyst called Daryl Johnson. It became a big scandal because he said that although all the money that the law enforcement is getting from the federal government is going towards looking into domestic Islamic fundamentalism threats, he said this is stupid and we need to realign because we have a lot of worrying cells, right-wing cells that could carry out atrocities. Now, the reaction to him, he was put out to pasture by the DHS. He was basically demoted, and now he's jobless. And he's just come out of a book, actually. But that is the reaction to anyone that was raising the alarm. And I mean, it's interesting your point about obviously not every active duty soldier, in fact, is a neo-Nazi or a crazy dude that's going to carry out a terrorist attack. In fact, in the acknowledgements of my book, I thank all the veterans that have come home and tried to fight for the medical and educational benefits that they deserve. But the point is that it's not that these people are representative of the whole. It's that they were allowed to serve openly, and they were allowed to by a military brass that knew they were there. And I mean that, and it wasn't covered at all in the media, which is another point which I should get across. In that, I don't know why. I'm often asked why are you the only journalist? Why did it take a British person to write this book? Which is quite a good question. I mean, if you have thousands of potentially dangerous neo-Nazis in your military, someone should be writing about that, no? And I don't know why it hasn't really been written about. I mean, there was one report by the Southern Poverty Law Centre, which is a great anti-racist group in the South, but apart from that, it wasn't covered at all. Now, that might be to do with the fact that this book sort of contradicts the whole fairy tale narrative of the war on terror, which is that the US and my home country, the UK, were spreading freedom and democracy to Iraq and Afghanistan. The idea that they were actually sending neo-Nazis and street gangs to do it doesn't really fit well with that sort of fairy tale, does it? So there might be something to do with that. But yeah, definitely, these people aren't representative of the military as a whole, but the fact that they were allowed to sell it openly is a scandal and it should be exposed. And hopefully if they're exposed enough, then law enforcement will take it as seriously as it should be taken. I mean, another interesting point just to add is that it also went for Islamic fundamentalists, this sort of open door policy. I don't know if you guys have heard of Nidal Malik Hassan, who was the guy that allegedly killed, I say allegedly because the trial's ongoing, but he allegedly killed 13 of his fellow soldiers at Fort Bragg in 2009. Now the FBI and the CID, which is the military's investigative unit, knew that he was sending tons of emails to Anwar Awlaki, who was the extremist cleric who was exiled in Yemen and was assassinated by the Obama administration in 2011. So he was dangerous enough to be assassinated by Obama, but yet the military did nothing when they knew that Nidal Malik Hassan was sending emails to him. And it's jaw-dropping looking into what happened with that case. I mean, in the end, Joe Lieberman, who I don't agree with on very much, he said that it was a ticking time bomb waiting to go off and it should have been caught, and that was undoubtedly true. So this sort of turning a blind eye to anyone who's serving went across the board. It wasn't just neo-Nazis. And as you say, it was because they were desperate. You said they probably weren't actively looking for these people. I think that's probably true, but the fact that they were so desperate that they let them so openly is scary in itself, and someone should be held to account and haven't been yet. And I mean, the person, as I said in the introduction, which you might have missed, but the person who set the stage for this whole thing was Donald Rumsfeld. And I mean, he had to take some flack for the Abu Ghraib torture scandal, but that's really the tip of the iceberg. And the Abu Ghraib torture scandal as well is also a function of the thesis of the book, in that it was carried out by a lot of the soldiers who carried out the Abu Ghraib torture scandal were drunk at the time, and obviously the military, in theory, bans alcohol completely. But the fact that they were allowing these people to stay in and allowing this sort of frat party culture to exist in Abu Ghraib, all came from the top. I mean, Donald Rumsfeld tried to cover up Abu Ghraib scandal after it happened, but I mean, and he probably successfully did cover up tons of stuff. I mean, it's important to note that there's just one ideology that the US military holds to at every stage, and it's deny, deny, deny. Every single case that I looked into in the military, that even the ones that, I don't know if you guys are aware of the infamous. There were two real infamous massacres in Iraq, which were Haditha and Mahmudiyah. And both were completely denied by the US military initially, and they said they were the work of insurgents, blah, blah, blah. And that went on for a couple of months until, in the case of Mahmudiyah, one soldier had a crisis of conscience and told his commanding officer, and it came out. In the case of Haditha, a local Iraqi took a video of the massacre when 24 women and children were killed. So it really scares you to think how many times it was successfully covered up, because although we know about Mahmudiyah and Haditha, there's probably 100 other cases like that we never heard about, and they said it was the work of insurgents, and that was that. And these people are back in the United States and the UK. So, yeah, it's pretty scary, all in all.
Okay, and I just wanted to add to that there is a whole chapter about the kind of good guys who we would want to get to do things like immigrants and gay people.
Actually, and I should also add that although the book's quite depressing, it is also the story of resistance, because there's some amazing active duty personnel who were raising the alarm about street gangs and neo-Nazis in their units, and every time they were targeted, I mean, there's one called Jeffrey Stolson who forms a large part of the gangs chapter, and he was serving in Iraq, and basically in his unit it literally was all street gangs, and he raised the alarm. He took tons of pictures which are in the book. Some of which are in the book, and he told his commanding officers, and he was targeted completely. Threats were made to his life. The military didn't help him at all. They basically punished him. So that's another important pattern that you see over and over again, is anyone who was raising the alarm, again and again, they would be targeted by the military. And I mean, there's tons of very brave individuals that stood up to that, but they suffered hugely. I mean, Jeffrey is now I think he's now getting treated for PTSD, which is partly to do with the fact he was targeted by the military and his fellow soldiers.
I have two questions to ask you.
Yeah.
Of the two massacres that you cited, is there any incident of neo-Nazis' involvement in those? And
Yeah.
the second one is that with the larger influx of neo-Nazis, that had to be very disruptive to a lot of unit morale and cohesiveness. And you just cited one incident about street gangs, but what about neo-Nazis taking orders from black officers or NCOs?
Well, I'll answer the second. That's a really good question, and it's quite a counterintuitive answer. Again, is that you had this situation where, I mean, I talked to extremist veterans who would say, look, if my gunner is a black guy, I'm not going to be preaching politics because he's basically got my back. And I mean, there is an internal logic to that. I mean, if you're in a war zone, you don't have, and you're a white supremacist, you don't really want to be flaunting it around, because the black guy who's a gunner is going to save your life if you get into a combat situation. So really, that didn't arise in the way that you would assume. I mean, I assumed before I started looking into it that this would have caused massive beef between the command structure and these crazy troops. But it didn't really, because people in the war zone, you can't afford to be preaching politics. And on the first question you had about were these massacres linked to neo-Nazis, it's a good question, and it's almost impossible to find out, because the military released very little information about the individuals involved. And I mean, in the case of Haditha, in the case of Mahmudiyah, the ringleader of that massacre was Stephen D. Green, and he was another soldier that got in the military on a moral waiver. So, I mean, you're seeing a pattern here already. He wasn't a neo-Nazi, but we probably wouldn't even know if he was a neo-Nazi. You have to basically do a lot of your own investigations. There was a case of a guy called Kenneth Eastridge who served in Iraq for 2 years. He was completely explicit about it. There's a picture of him in here. He had SS bolts, which are the Nazi insignia tattooed on his arm, served over there, came back and was part of a team that killed one of their fellow soldiers in Colorado Springs. He's now in prison. Now, in the aftermath of that, another guy in his platoon, Jose Barco, said that they would take a stolen AK-47 and go around the streets of Baghdad taking pot shots at Iraqis. I mean, and no one's ever been charged for shooting Iraqi civilians in Baghdad. They've only been charged for a murder they carried out here. And you see that over and over again. The only clues we get to what these people were doing in Iraq and Afghanistan is what they did when they were back in the US, because obviously if you murder someone in the US, you can't escape law enforcement. Whereas if you did it in Iraq, you could just easily cover it up and no one knows. So you get hints from what these people are doing over there, only from what you know about what they were doing in the States. Not because they weren't doing anything in Iraq and Afghanistan, just because we'll never know. I mean, that's the scary thing. When I was going through all these massacres, every time you see, firstly it was denied, then somehow it came out and the military could deny it no longer, and then it became infamous, and then you think, how many times must that have happened and we'll never know about it? I mean, it even happened with the the collateral murder video, which was what the video that WikiLeaks released, where the helicopter gunship just took out kids and journalists, etc. Even when that came out and it was so obvious that this was a cold-blooded murder of innocent people, the US military initially said, oh no, that guy had an RPG, which was a lie. He had a video camera. So they try it every single time. So we probably know 0.1% of what happened there. And to answer your question directly, it's hard to find out what these people were doing over there just because of that fact.
Well, actually, my question follows up on that. What about, are there any other journalists from, what about in Iraq? Is this covered in Iraq? What these people are doing?
What, sorry?
Well, is there any information that gets out in other countries much more so than the United States?
Yeah, I don't know because I don't speak Arabic or read Arabic, but I'm sure, and I don't know how strong the press is in Iraq. That's the problem that you have, is that you really do rely on Western reporters to get this stuff out. And the US military doesn't help you. Look what they've done to WikiLeaks. The message they send out is just do not investigate anything that we've done. So it's hard for me to answer that question because I actually have never been to Iraq or Afghanistan, so I don't know how these massacres are presented there by the local media, but I guess it's probably more open. The US media is probably more protected. And also, the issue of I don't know if you guys have heard of the Nisour Square massacre, which was carried out by Blackwater, where a Blackwater convoy just mass murdered a whole bunch of people in Iraq, and they were spirited out. That was initially denied, and then they were spirited out of the country because private contractors aren't subject to any laws, so they were spirited out of Iraq before there could be any case against them.
I had one other question.
Yeah.
When you were interviewing some of these people, especially neo-Nazis, white supremacists, how did you get them to talk to you?
Well, that's a good question. I'm often asked, and it's there's two sides to it. One is the extremist veterans was quite difficult to talk to because they were obviously wary of it, because there's not many neo-Nazi journalists in the US or the UK, so they know that you're not going to be writing nice things about them. But then it's that whole banality of evil thing. These people, aside from the fact that their views are disgusting and repugnant, like they're normal people in other ways. Like one of the main interviewees in the book, I went to the zoo with him in Tampa, Florida, and his kids. And you see him with his kids, and he's just like a normal guy, loving dad. But then he'll just come out with this crazy, obscene, racist stuff. So, you can build a rapport with them. I never went undercover. People do that. I think it's pretty dangerous to do. So everyone was on the record. And that's the extremist veterans. The far-right leaders is actually quite easy to talk to because they want exposure. It's hard to vet what they say for truth because they often, there's a lot of bravado. But another way of talking and communicating with these people is there's a vast amount of online activities. There's even like a Facebook for white supremacists called New Saxon, where all these people doing Hitler salutes and joining. And I found out a lot of stuff with that because there's even membership. There's even groups that are called white military members and stuff. So it's actually not as hard as you think. Street gangs is harder because they don't have websites and they try and stay away from law enforcement. So I actually never interviewed. I didn't actively interview street gangs. I interviewed whistleblowers who had served with them in the military, like Jeffrey Stolson, who I mentioned earlier, and there's a couple of others. So there's ways around it. But yeah, it wasn't as hard to contact the neo-Nazi groups as you would assume.
Time for one or two more questions. I'm going to go to Flint, and then I'm going to go back there.
Right. Ryan, what you were saying about in regards to them being just desperate for any kind of people, just a really short anecdote is that I've been an anarchist communist since the late 90s, pretty publicly out there about that. My sister had joined the National Guard, and so then I decided I would do everything possible to be politically out against the war and make my politics part of it. I got arrested for the war. I went to Canada. I did interviews in the Montreal Mirror. I published a well-circulated radical publication talking about the human capital equation in Iraq, and specifically that we had to target military recruitment centers and to do what we could do to oppose recruitment. I sent her subversive literature in the mail. I did everything possible to say, hey, I'm a crazy anarchist communist. You know, you probably don't want to trust my sister in any situation like that.
Right.
They sent her anyway. She spent a year in Iraq, outside of Baghdad. My politics had been discussed with her by her commanders, but nothing came of that. And I would think, like, almost in any other time in American history, they would not have decided to keep her on as, like, a desk clerk in Iraq, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And so, you know, in practicality, you know, maybe she had some problems with security clearance, but in actual business of doing the work, you know, a doctor would just give her the rights to do whatever.
Yeah.
And so if that was happening on the left wing of the folks who are vehemently out against the war.
Yeah.
Then people maybe became a little quiet, probably gotten in no trouble,
Yeah.
done whatever they wanted to do. But larger scheme of that, at the time when I was looking at this issue, I did not know how they would have enough boots on the ground to do it. And I knew they were using mercenaries who were very expensive, you know, on the aggregate. And I was really confused about how they were actually going to make a go of this. But I knew from my experience that, well, we're going to deploy the National Guard more. We're going to deploy troops 2, 3, 4 terms.
Yeah.
Afghanistan, Iraq. Afghanistan, Iraq. Oh, you can have a deployment in Qatar, right?
Yeah.
And then also the use of the individual ready reserve, which kept me up many a night wondering, are they going to call my sister back up as individual ready reserve? She knew that a lot of what she did as medical work is she did a lot of pregnancy tests and drug tests in the military of people in Iraq, you know, to see what was going to happen. You know, if you got pregnant, you probably got cycled back, but if you got high,
no.
Right? So maybe you could talk a little bit about, like, not necessarily the neo-Nazis, but what they were doing in terms of other deferments and that they would get rid of.
Well, I mean, what you said is really interesting. It basically is the thesis. I mean, the neo-Nazis, I mean, the first chapter is called The Other, Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and that focuses on neo-Nazis, felons, and gangs. But as you say, there was much, I mean, comparatively more benign groups that they were allowing in. So fat people, for example, they stopped kicking them out. I got figures from the Pentagon which basically showed that discharges for being overweight halved during the war on terror, and that wasn't because they suddenly had a much more fit troop base. It was because they stopped kicking out fat soldiers. And I mean, it is quite funny, but I mean, it's also serious because I mean, on the battlefield, it's really dangerous to have. You can get heart. I mean, there were cases of soldiers dying of heart attacks because they had too much body weight. I mean, there's a reason that they have those body weight limits. And I mean, just to go back to what you're saying as well. I mean, it's important to. I haven't talked about this, but there's the third chapter of the book is about how the U.S. military does not target a representative demographic of the U.S. population to stock their wars. They target the poor, they target the black community, and they target the Hispanic community, and it's explicit. I mean, I went through the recruiters' handbooks, and they tell their recruiters, like, make sure you go, this is in high schools, make sure you go to Black History Month, make sure you go to Latino heritage events, etc., etc. And you see that time and time again. And the militarization of schools was a massive thing during the war on terror as well, because the No Child Left Behind Act, which was Bush's flagship bit of educational reform, had a caveat deep in thousands of pages of it that military recruiters schools had to hand over the emails, the phone numbers, and the addresses of their students to military recruiters. And you saw like thousands of young kids being recruited this way. There was a junior reserve officer training corps, which is another thing which penetrates into educational institutions. They just targeted the young and people who are basically easy to manipulate with promises of education, etc., etc. So yeah, I mean, basically across the board, it was just a shit show. Basically, I mean, you had the manipulating and targeting of the poorest people in the United States. You had the fact that they stopped kicking out people who are overweight. You had the fact that they were stopped treating people with PTSD. I mean, that was another thing. Because they were strapped for cash at the time, there's countless investigations that showed that they were misdiagnosing post-traumatic stress disorder with what they called a personality disorder, which was the same thing, but basically meant that they didn't have to give them any treatment. And I mean, this is one of the... I mean, I don't live in the States now, but I'm back now. And with the election season, you see Mitt Romney and the Republicans, and they present themselves as the party of the armed forces. I mean, it's the complete opposite of the truth. The Republican Party, during the war on terror, and still now, they basically target the veteran community mercilessly. I mean, you guys will know Paul Ryan, the kind of crazy vice presidential candidate for Mitt Romney. His 2011 fiscal year budget, which was basically wanted to eviscerate the whole of the welfare state in the US, it got rid completely of the one program which houses homeless veterans. And I mean, no one talks about that. The fact that he can masquerade. I mean, the Republican Party masquerades as the party of the armed forces, salute our troops, etc. Meanwhile, they cut their benefits for healthcare. They cut their educational benefits. They send them back to the war zone for multiple tours. I mean, the Democrats aren't much better, but they are better. I mean, the evisceration of the homeless veterans program was fought by Obama and various Democrats. So yeah, I hope that answers it.
Right there. I'm going to get this mic as close to you as I can.
My question is regarding street gangs. And for many young people who are involved with street gangs, they might see military service as a means of getting out of that life, especially regarding the educational benefits that they might not otherwise have any access to.
Yeah.
So how is it possible to prevent street gangs from using the military as a means of training without discriminating against people with that background who might be looking for other opportunities?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. And I mean, that is an important point, is that rather than just, I mean, neo-Nazis is a different case because they're violent, racist arsewipes, basically. But in terms of other groups where it is often just they're in a street gang because it's a symptom of the fact they've had no opportunities in life, or that basically it's the only way they can make a living, etc. They shouldn't just be targeted for that. And I mean, in the case of street gangs, there isn't actually any regulation of street gangs in the U.S. military. There never has been explicit regulation. They count on the fact that most street gang members have a criminal record, which would bar them. I mean, it would have barred them before the War on Terror, but they probably would have got a moral waiver during the War on Terror. So, in answer to your question, I don't think that at the moment they are. I don't think there's any regulation that does discriminate against street gangs escaping the hood, because there is undoubtedly that did happen. I'm sure that some street gangs, but I would say, just add that is the minority. I think obviously some escape, but obviously if you're in a street gang going into the military and getting weapons training and tactical skills in Iraq and Afghanistan is going to be a boon when you come back and you want to fight your wars on the streets of the US. So you have to balance that out. I mean, during the War on Terror, it got so serious that they couldn't even do basic domestic troop movements. There was a case where there was a tranche of soldiers that were moving from the East Coast to a base in El Paso, and there was two rival street gangs in each of the tranches of soldiers, and they just couldn't move them. They had to keep them apart. I mean, it was that's how serious the situation was. And I mean, I'm often asked about the neo-Nazis, which is understandable because it's really worrying. But in terms of numbers, the street gangs is the really worrying one, because a lot of analysts say that 10% of the U.S. armed forces are street gangs, and that's huge amounts. And they're not in the military, most of them, because they want to serve the red, white, and blue. They're in the military because they want tactical skills and weapons. But the more general point you make, that desperate people that have done bad things because they have had no other choice should not be locked out of the military and other institutions of society, I agree with. But I mean, there's a balancing act you've got to do, and the point is, during the War on Terror, that there was no balancing act. They just let in whoever wanted to serve could. And that will cause. I mean, and there's kind of the crisis is already happening on the southern border with Mexico. I mean, we don't hear about it that much because most of the violence carried out by active duty personnel and veteran community who are in street gangs is inter-gang violence, so it doesn't affect the general public. So we don't really hear about it. So we don't know the names, but there's murders and stuff happening all the time, with even involving Mexican drug cartels who are using active duty personnel to traffic drugs and weapons. So I mean, that can't be tolerated, and it shouldn't be tolerated. And I think there's a balancing act you can do where you don't lock people out, but you stop stuff like that happening.
I think we've got time for one more question. Okay.
What type of training, other than combat training and firearms training, is desired and sought by these groups?
Well, I mean, you get all types of training in the military, but I think the weapons one and tactical skills as well. I mean, it wasn't just your army privates that were members of white supremacist groups. I heard of countless commanders that were also subscribed to this kind of ideology, and obviously they're getting skills from from the top military academies in the world on how to carry out combat missions. So it's weapons and tactical skills. But I mean, that's enough to cause all sorts of problems when they're back in the States. So, I mentioned the Sikh Temple massacre, but you had the Fort Stewart militia who were using, if you look into the plans they had for their campaign to assassinate Obama and poison the water supply, they were using things they learned in the military. And you see that I was mentioning street gangs. There was a case in Ceres, California, where a former Marine killed 2 police officers, and he was using a technique known as cutting the pie, where you go on the attack rather than retreat, and that's how he managed to kill 2 police officers. So I don't know if there's anything else they really desire, but I think that's enough, and it's shown countless times that if you've got training that puts you in a position where you can kill 2 police officers before being killed yourself, that's a pretty worrying thing. And we're talking about thousands of people with this kind of training now. So what that will mean over the next couple of decades in the United States, we don't know. I mean, we're getting clues. We've got clues in recent months, but I mean, it will probably get a lot worse. I mean, the far right is on the rise. I mean, the Southern Poverty Law Center released a report a year ago saying that right-wing militia groups and white supremacist groups had increased 500% in 2 years. So, and there's a large amount of these veterans and a large amount of these members have had time in the army. So it's going to be a worrying couple of decades in that context for the United States domestic population.
So we're going to have to figure out how to fight as race traitors. Thank you so much, Matt. Really, really wonderful research. Really interesting book. Did you have any closing remarks you wanted to make?
Well, I'll just close with one thing, because I think this is quite interesting for you guys. Is the book closes with a comparison between what happened to the Roman Empire with what's happening now with the U.S. military. I mean, the Roman Empire is held up as an example as one of the biggest fall from graces in history, one of the swiftest and biggest falls from grace. I mean, they ruled the world with valor and discipline for centuries, and then within 100 years they were nothing. Now, there's still much scholarly debate about why that fall came when it did and why it came. But one of the main trains of thought is that the Roman military basically started allowing in people that it hadn't before. It let in people who were undesirables from the domestic population, and they also started letting in what they called barbarians, and the process was called barbarization. And there's a bunch of scholars now who say that the degradation of the Roman fighting force was a prelude to their fall from grace. Now, as we all know, American decline is a vogue topic in academia and the media world right now. Since the financial crisis and the failures in Iraq and Afghanistan, there's a lot of talk about how, and it's palpable when you're in the States, everyone's talking about how can we make America great again. You've got China on the rise, and there's this feeling that America power is eking away. And no one's really made the connection with the fact that the military completely changed during the war on terror. But that was an interesting point that I wrote a couple of thousand words on, and it's worth thinking about whether the fact that these desirables firstly were allowed to serve, but also how that's gonna damage U.S. society over the next couple of decades. Is that prelude to something similar, and is it a factor in this whole American decline narrative?